So everyone up against the wall, hands up. My father, there he was, and there was a villager with a gun poking him in the back.
Mr. Alp Mehmet, thank you very much for joining me in this second episode of The Extraordinary. As the viewers will hopefully start to understand by now, I'm seeking out what I would term ordinary people with extraordinary stories to tell. So would you mind just giving us a little flavour of where we are in the world?
In the heart of the universe.
Okay.
Limehouse, rivers just out there, the Thames, narrow street. It's one of the oldest streets in London.
Okay.
It's a narrow street because there wasn't room for two carriages to pass each other, hence narrow of old. And there are all sorts of places, the Grapes pub down the road, all sorts of worthies living along here, and then you come to me. This area of London was very much, it was where trade into the country from all over the empire, as it was in those days. I mean, all around here. This is Docklands.
Yeah. Tell me a bit about your early life.
I'm a first generation migrant.
Okay.
I'm someone who came here as an 8-year-old. My father came in 1950, and he was here for around 5.5 years before returning to Cyprus. When he returned to Cyprus, it was ostensibly to stay. I mean, he'd sold up here. I mean, in that short time, he'd worked, he'd sent money back, he bought a house. He was sort of trying to set up, trying to see what he would do with his little pile of gold that he'd managed to put together. And he was at the cinema in Limassol. And he said all of a sudden, open air cinema, lights went on and the place was surrounded by soldiers, British soldiers, including Turkish Cypriots who were serving within with the British Army. So everyone up against the wall, hands up. My father, there he was, and there was a villager with a gun poking him in the back. And he said, "You know who I am. You know I'm not a terrorist." Quiet, he said. This is not personal. And my father thought, came home and he said to my mother, "I'm going to go back to London. Are you going to come with me?" And my mother said, "You're not going to the loo," she said, "without me accompanying you. If you think you're going to leave me on my own here with our boy for another however many years, you've got another thing coming." We set sail from there to Piraeus in Greece, from Piraeus to Naples to Marseille, Marseille to Calais by train.
Okay.
The ferry to Dover Marine, and we arrived on the 26th of July, 1956. I remember the train coming into London, and I remember seeing the first bus, double-decker bus, which was green. I thought, "Wait, hold on a moment."
That wasn't on the postcard.
Where are we? In December 1956, we moved to a place in Bethnal Green.
Okay.
Street called Hollybush Gardens.
So East London.
A misnomer if ever there was one. But it was wonderful.
Okay.
East London, very East London.
Okay.
It was post-war. Our street, at the end, there was an English family. Next door to them, there were Greek Cypriots, living with an English family. Then there was a Turkish Cypriot family where we were. Next to us were a family of Sikhs. Next to them, there were Irish, Poles. There was a family, some young men, essentially, 2 or 3, who had their other halves there as well. And they were Barbadians, I seem to recall. But that was it. Really, elsewhere, primary school, for example, I was the only child there that didn't speak English. They were all Tommies and Johnnies and Rogers, but essentially it was all English.
Yeah.
Our teachers were all they'd all served during the war. And in fact, there was one, I remember him, handlebar moustache, snuff-taking, but he'd actually fought in the First World War, let alone the Second World War. There was one teacher, Mrs. Goff. There was this fearsome 75-year-old. And my goodness, she was extraordinary. But she taught not only the parents of some of the children, but a lot of their grandparents. But they were all communities that had sort of grown up, born in the area and stayed in the area.
Yeah.
So that was the sort of East End community that we were living in. It was great. Yeah, I loved it.
What was the neighbourhood like? What sort of accommodation were you living in? And how were you received by, those who were perhaps here before?
Bear in mind, this was only sort of, 10, 11, 12 years after the war. There were still lots of bomb sites where we had great fun. We would be there. And I mean, really, safety, my goodness. Just didn't come into it. How we survived, I'm not so sure. There were these huge fires that we would suddenly set off. There would be these enormous ditches and holes in the ground that we would sort of remember chucking some mattresses at the bottom of one, and we would jump from, Lord knows when onto these mattresses. Thought it was great. I mean, that was sort of the playing part of our lives.
Yeah.
The fun. We were all poor.
Yeah.
No question. We were all poor. We were. So the environment was poor. There wasn't very much there. Our house, there were 2 outside loos. The sinks were sort of the old Belfast sinks or whatever. We would have a bath, tin bath. Often have a bath with my cousins where... This sounds a little bit like Monty Python, it were rough. But that's the way it was. We didn't want for anything. We ate well. There was a sort of a family community, and they lived within sort of half a mile of each other. Weekends at someone's house where the women would prepare food,
right.
The men would sit down, we would eat, men and women would talk about the old days back in Cyprus. There would be singing, kids would be invited. I instructed to deliver a poem, to sing a song, or say what they'd been up to in school. What I recall vividly was not being able to understand what was going on. And then the same sort of thing when I ended up in Bethnal Green. It was that sense of living in a world where you imagine being deaf and not quite understanding what was going on, what was being said. But my goodness, it was a driver to learn to speak the language, and that like it or not, you were forced into not only learning the language but understanding the ways of those around you, in a way that some of my cousins who were born here, I mean, they were in a slightly different position because they actually understood that world. They were born into it. They knew a little about the world that their parents came from, though not much. But at school, it was just English. If you went to the GP, it was English. There was no interpreters being brought in. And you learn very quickly. And I remember my cousins taking the mickey, saying to me, say abracadabra. And I say abracadabra. And at school, there was the 11 plus in those days. So the age of, actually in my case, I was the youngest in my year. My birthday's at the end of August, and the cut-off point is the 1st of September, and still is actually. So I was in classes with children that effectively year older and year more education, tuition, and by some inexplicable, still don't understand. I think my greatest achievement in life was actually passing the 11 plus. It was downhill all the way after that. But we ended up in an East End grammar school, which was also all boys. It was really, for a lot of us, it was the key really to progressing in the sort of society that we were going to grow up. I ended up head boy. It was terrific. Went to college afterwards. What was really part of Bristol Polytechnic, now the University of West of England. Met my wife there. We married pretty much when we were still students, and we were together for the next 55 years nearly. We were products of the 60s revolution, really. We almost grew up together. I mean, we were. I remember my mother-in-law when we were off to a university dance ball soon after we left, and we left holding hands. And my mother-in-law, she said, she stood there crying. She thought, they're kids. And we were. But, kids who really, we set out on our own, made a life together, and we're very happy together. And and I miss her a lot. Yeah, I miss my wife a great deal because she's part and parcel of who I am, and whatever sort of modicum of achievements I've had. I think I owe pretty much everything to her.
You went off to Bristol, met your wife. Tell me about your journey into the working world.
It was via working for my father-in-law, who had a little building business. It was a case of suddenly having to become serious about actually earning a living and looking after my family. Father-in-law, he was a plasterer. He was probably the best plasterer that I've ever come across. That was very different to the working class culture that we'd grown up in.
Okay.
But the values were very similar. They overlapped in so many ways.
Mm.
I was mixing plaster, had sort of callous fingers. I'd already done some building site jobs in both at school and at college.
Yeah.
I suppose at the back of my mind was doing something along the lines that my family, my father, been part of, sort of the service sector.
Okay.
My mother-in-law was at the hairdresser's one day, and she came back with I forget what paper it was. There was an ad in there: Keys to the Kingdom. Would you like to be interviewing an American banker 1 minute or a Swedish au pair the next? Do you have a flair for languages? Interviewing Swedish au pair rather appealed to a 21-year-old. Elaine actually sent for the application form, and she pretty much completed it. A couple of days later, I was interviewed for the civil service. A few days later came the letter saying that I'd been successful for the immigration service and that I would be posted to Dover. I went into London. I'd signed my life to the state. I will not divulge anything I learn, and the Official Secrets Act and all that. And eventually made my way to Dover, and I sat there looking around. There were a lot of people who had similar backgrounds to me. And one of them came up to me and says, "Do you drink?" I said, "Yeah, and I enjoy a pint." "Right, shift your ass," he said. And he took me off to the pub. I later discovered that he was my roommate in the digs that we were staying in. Anyway, that was my introduction to the immigration service. And I loved it. Not knowing what was going to happen next. You never quite knew who was going to come up to your desk next. And you learned your trade. I trained at Heathrow. It was 1970. And I really did think, well, by accident, I've actually ended up doing something that I really enjoy. And that really, I did that for 9 years.
Yeah.
I worked around the country. I did after entry work. I interviewed people who were indefinite leave to remain applicants. I interviewed people who had applied for British citizenship and had to sort of report back to the Home Office as to whether I felt that they were good and proper people to grant citizenship to. After 8-9 years, I applied to be an entry clearance officer, a visa officer overseas. The first time I applied, I was turned down. The second time, I was accepted and was posted to Lagos, where I spent 4 years sort of interviewing people who wanted to come to Britain.
Okay.
And
what was it like in Nigeria?
Difficult. Nigeria had been under military rule. There was military dictatorship, and it had switched to civilian rule on the 1st of October, so 2 weeks before I got there.
Wow.
And that was, the president was Shehu Shagari, and that was really, it was 4 years of the country that was supposed to be getting on to a firmer, more certain path from which the people would benefit, actually deteriorating and declining because of the corruption.
And you saw that firsthand?
Saw that firsthand. I learned a lot about Nigerians. I learned a lot about Africa. And then I was on loan.
Yep.
I was on loan to the Foreign Office. At the end of my time there, I suppose I did pretty well. They suggested that I might like to stay in the Foreign Office,
Okay.
and invited me to apply. I did, and ended up joining the Foreign Office, and formally transferring in 1983. I came back, and I then spent 3 years at the Foreign Office, and my first job as a diplomat was in the diplomatic service, was private secretary to one of the junior ministers.
Okay.
Because he was after someone who had experience of immigration work. It was 4 fascinating years. Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister. It was soon after the 83 election, 3 years when I would see cabinet minutes and all the people that sort of became a part of the history of the times. There they all were. Then sitting at my desk and had a call to say, got a posting for you, Bucharest, get in touch with your predecessor and arrange a handover. And that was it.
Wow.
I had to learn the language. And this was early 86, I suppose. Learned the language, spent about 6 months learning Romanian, and then posted to Romania. I was a political officer, and a lot of what I had to do was report back on conditions and also maintain a degree of contact with the dissidents that were there. But Romania at the time, this was Cold War. Ceausescu was president. Professionally, that was my most satisfying posting. Things that we did suddenly, would pop up in world news. There was one occasion where there was a woman called Doina Cornea, and she was up in the north of Romania, and she was under house arrest. We were instructed to make contact and draw attention, highlight that there she was under house arrest. And the ambassador went up and took me with him, and we eventually made our way there. We were being monitored. They had tried to block off the road. Suddenly, no entry signs would appear. We made our way, and there was this sort of confrontation. And the ambassador, Hugh Arbuthnot, at the time, he said, "I'm going in." And you could see these petrified, big burly coppers with Securitate around, saying, this was all in Romanian. "No, sir. I'm sorry, sir. I cannot allow that, sir. How dare you?" He said, "I am the British ambassador." And he sort of went up, and this chap sort of there. But I was tiny, they sort of brushed me out of the way. But then with that, Doina Cornea appeared at the door, and she came running over, and she was in her nightgown, I think, and had dressing gown on. She flying down that path almost as if she was sort of Batman, And she said, tell them in Vienna. And at the time there were sort of talks going on in Vienna. Tell the BBC. So came back, and we just fed everything in. And next thing you know, it just went around the world. Romania was fabulous as professionally. Lots of other stories I could tell as well. Gorbachev visiting. From there, I came back to London and was waiting to be told where I would be going to next. The Foreign Office wouldn't tell me. They knew, but they wouldn't tell me for some reason or other. Elaine was sitting there, and as I was sort of repeating the hints that he was giving me, she said, "I'm not going to bloody Iceland." She said, "What am I going to do there?" "Yeah, you're going on your own." Anyway, we did go to Iceland. That was the first time in '89. 4 years there, fabulous time. It was a state visit, which was, I'm told, one of the reasons that they wanted me there. It's the only state visit ever paid to Iceland. The Queen, Prince Philip were coming. That was just fabulous. But apart from that, Iceland was a fascinating place because although it's a tiny place, but it's a microcosm of everything that we've got here. It's a parliament. It has its parliament. Place is democratic. It's economically, it was quite vibrant, although had become so from being very poor. We loved Iceland. And Elaine, in the end, having had a job to get her there, in the end, I had a job to get her out. I came back to London, and I was first parliamentary clerk to the Foreign Office, so responsible for things like foreign affairs bit of parliamentary PMQs. So, when John Major got up to speak on, it was twice a week then, everything had been prepared by me. Another fascinating time. I moved from there to the press office. I was one of the spokesmen. And the really important bit for me was Hong Kong. It was during the latter stages of the negotiations with the Chinese to hand Hong Kong back to the Chinese. And that was fascinating. And then I was posted to Bonn, which was still the capital of Germany, but it was in preparation to moving the embassy back to where it was before the war. The Queen actually formally opened the new embassy, and as far as we could make out, it was the only time that the monarch ever opened one of our missions overseas.
And you were there?
I was there for that, yes, indeed. And yet again, I was had the honour of showing Her Majesty around and Prince Philip. After Berlin, 4 years in Berlin, just having heard that I was going to be posted as ambassador to Iceland, appointed as the first migrant born, first generation appointment as ambassador, that really was, it was a big deal. I mean, you're there representing your country. It was an extraordinary privilege. Iceland, I mean, it was all building up. And I remember vividly reporting back, just trying to draw attention to the fact that people at this end were looking at the wrong end, the wrong starting point. Finance minister at the time, who'd studied here, and he loved Britain, and he thought, we would rescue them. Whereas it was very clear from the meeting with Gordon Brown that Britain had more important things to do. I'd already left by then. I mean, had I been in Iceland, my advice to the Icelanders would have been just stay away from our media. Dare I say, our media was really looking to the Treasury. Alistair Darling was really pointing to the fact that the money that had been invested in the Icelandic banks, that the Brits, who we were concerned with, were not going to be compensated. They were not. And that wasn't really what the Icelanders were saying. The Icelanders were saying, no, we will compensate in the way that we will compensate Icelanders. Alistair Darling said, well, so you heard yesterday what the Icelandic finance minister said, that Brits are not going to be compensated. And then we used the legislation that had been intended to tackle terrorist funds and funding, effectively to bring down the Icelandic banks, one bank in particular. Certainly my advice would have been, look, we can actually take these banks into our control and our ownership. And all it would require is, yes, okay, us saying, no, the Icelanders are okay, this is peanuts, we will back it. But having extracted from the Icelanders, part ownership, if not total ownership of the banks. And that didn't happen. But the Icelanders, not only have they got their act together, but they've really reverted to that position of really being really very well off.
Let's bring it to present day. So based on your ebbs and flows of life and the 7 languages that you've learnt and getting your hands dirty, but also shaking hands with dignitaries, where are you today in life? And what are your thoughts on society and how things are going currently?
I retired in 2008, so 17 years ago. I have done quite a bit. The suggestion was that I might stay on if I wanted to. And I thought, no, I've spent nearly 40 years believing that at the age of 60 I would go off and do other things. I'm not going to change my mind now. I did various consultancies, various projects that I took on, some of them for the government. Read a piece in, I think it was the Telegraph, by Sir Andrew Green, a diplomat who I knew in the Foreign Office, but he, a bit older than me, he'd retired a few years before I did, and set up an organisation called Migration Watch.
Okay.
And what he was doing and saying is that migration was out of control, that if we wanted to avoid future problems, we really had to constrain the inflows. We had to make sure that the rate at which people were coming into the country was manageable, that we could provide the right number of homes, we could provide the education that the kids needed, that our health service would not be sort of suddenly overburdened by the number of people that it needed to treat. And that was it, really. I dropped a line to Andrew and said, you've been saying some of the things that I've been saying for a long time as former immigration officer, first generation migrant who sort of became a part of the establishment, some would argue, but I would say, well, no, it shows the extent to which I integrated, that I assimilated, became a part of this society rather than isolated away from it. And that was really when Andrew and I remember we met over a bite. He said, join me. And I did. I am not in any way, nor would I wish to, deny my origins, my past, who I am. And that is something that is fundamental to the way that I feel about what is my country, the United Kingdom. but I am a Turkish Cypriot. I say Turkish because there were two distinct communities that had joint sovereignty of the island. And my family, where we're from, the village that I was born in, I'm hellish proud of that. But you can be all those things, I would argue, and still actually regard the United Kingdom, England, as far as I'm concerned, as my country. Because whatever I come from, it is the United Kingdom, it is England, it's the London of 60, nearly 70 years ago that really contributed to making me whatever I am today.
Yeah.
One should never deny or ignore or be ashamed of one's past. I'm not. I'm very proud of it.
Alp, it's been an absolute pleasure talking to you today. Thank you so much for having me here in Limehouse.
Privilege and pleasure for me.
Yeah.
Thank you
very much indeed for being on The Extraordinary.